Have you ever wondered what hidden hazards once lurked in everyday homes? From radioactive personal care products to shockingly flammable baby items, past generations unknowingly lived alongside dangerous innovations. In this video, we're peeling back the layers of nostalgia and scientific oversight to expose 20 perilous household products that vanished for good, thankfully, never to return. Number 1. Fossy matches. These notorious fire starters first emerged in the 19th century and continued to appear in some households well into the early 20th century. They contained white phosphorus, a substance so hazardous that factory workers in Europe and America developed a severe ailment called fossy jaw, where their jawbones deteriorated from toxic exposure. Even in the United States, these matches were marketed in old commercials as a convenient way to light stoves, lanterns, and candles. Parents of the 1930s and 1940s might remember seeing them around their grandparents' homes, completely unaware of the health risks. If a matchstick was accidentally chewed by a curious child, it could lead to organ damage and possibly death. Although these matches could ignite easily, the real hidden danger lay in prolonged contact with white phosphorus dust. By the early 1900s, concerns about the dreadful effects on workers and consumers prompted many countries to legislate bans or heavy restrictions. Safer alternatives using red phosphorus replaced the lethal white kind, but there remain cautionary tales of vintage matchboxes found in antique collections. Today, modern safety regulations ensure that fossy matches stay in the past, out of Gen X and baby boomer memories, never to be used again. Number 2. Uranium-tinted glass. Known as Vaseline glass or uranium glass, this striking product appeared in the 1930s and 1940s, often showcased at social gatherings and featured in glamorous Hollywood movies. Its glowing yellowish-green hue under ultraviolet light came from trace amounts of uranium oxide. Homeowners used it in decorative bowls, cups, and even candy dishes, thinking it added a dash of retro flair. Though the radioactivity levels were typically low, prolonged exposure still posed potential health hazards. Moreover, the production process put factory workers at risk, as repeated handling of uranium-laced materials could have significant long-term health consequences. These glass pieces sometimes showed up in old America's photo albums or on the sets of vintage TV commercials. By the late 20th century, growing awareness of radiation's dangers and stricter nuclear regulatory standards led to a steep decline in uranium glass manufacturing. Collectors still hunt for these luminous items at flea markets, but modern guidelines heavily discourage everyday contact or use for food and beverages. This once trendy glassware stands as a reminder of how novelty sometimes overshadowed safety before more rigorous product regulations took hold. Number 3. Arsenic-laced wallpaper. In the 19th century and continuing into the early 20th, vibrant wallpaper owed its bright green tones to copper arsenite pigments. Households in the 1930s that still had older wallpaper might have unknowingly lived among toxic dust. When damp conditions arose, mold would metabolize the arsenic, releasing toxic fumes. Families reported headaches, mysterious illnesses, and in some cases, severe health impacts on children. This decorative danger was prevalent in certain Golden Age residences, where the quest for fashionable patterns trumped caution. Over time, research connected chronic arsenic exposure to organ damage and even cancers. As interior design moved forward, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, safer synthetic dyes replaced arsenic-based pigments. By the 1970s, arsenic wallpaper had all but disappeared from mainstream catalogs, though it can still be found in some old estates and historic houses. Restoration experts now warn about the hazards of removing such wallpaper without proper protective gear. Baby boomers and Gen Xers who recall grandparents' Victorian or early 20th century homes might have glimpsed these ornate prints, unaware of the invisible threat they posed. Number 4. Blow dryers with asbestos insulation. In mid-20th century America, many electric hair dryers were lined with asbestos to prevent overheating and fires. As the market for personal grooming tools boomed in the 1950s and 1960s, companies used asbestos, a cheap and highly heat-resistant mineral, to keep plastic casings from melting. Unfortunately, when parts wore down or dust accumulated in vents, tiny asbestos fibers could be released. Those preparing for a glamorous night out, perhaps mimicking old Hollywood stars, had no idea they were inhaling these microscopic threads. Prolonged inhalation could cause severe lung conditions, including mesothelioma and asbestosis, decades after exposure. By the 1970s, new regulations and consumer protection movements gained momentum, fueled by revelations of workers in asbestos mines developing respiratory cancers. Manufacturers phased out asbestos in favor of safer insulation. Today, vintage blow dryers with asbestos-laden parts represent an era where quick solutions overshadowed concerns about toxicity. They are a stark testament to how little was understood about certain minerals in everyday products, reminding modern consumers that careful regulation and testing are vital to public health. Number 5. Refrigerators with toxic coolants. Early household refrigerators from the 1930s onward commonly used substances like sulfur dioxide or methyl chloride as refrigerants. These chemicals, if leaked, posed serious risks, ranging from respiratory distress to poisoning. Families in the post-war 1950s considered the fridge a modern convenience, often showing it off in proud home snapshots or old commercials, unaware that a faulty seal could release a dangerous gas. In closed kitchens, even a minor leak could cause dizziness, nausea, or collapse. The push for safer alternatives gained traction in the late 1940s and early 1950s, culminating in the adoption of Freon, though later discovered to harm the ozone layer. By the time baby boomers were establishing their own households in the 1970s, manufacturers had largely abandoned these highly toxic coolants. Modern refrigeration technology now favors less hazardous blends and invests in improved sealing mechanisms. While older models show up in retro-themed exhibits, they carry warnings that highlight the perils of early coolant choices, underscoring how changing regulations and scientific progress enhance everyday safety. Number 6. Phenol-heavy disinfectants. During the 1940s and 1950s, housekeeping guides often recommended phenol-based cleaners for their impressive germ-killing strength. Advertisements portrayed them as must-haves in the baby boom era, particularly for bathrooms and kitchens. Yet phenol, also called carbolic acid, is highly corrosive and can cause severe skin irritation, chemical burns, and respiratory distress if inhaled in high concentrations. In older commercials, the emphasis was on eradicating every last germ, with little mention of potential harm to users or children. By the 1960s, medical evidence linked repeated phenol exposure to organ damage, prompting a reevaluation of household cleaning standards. Manufacturers started reformulating their products with milder ingredients, and stricter labeling requirements emerged by the 1970s. While phenol-based disinfectants still exist in some industrial contexts, they are rarely found in everyday homes. This shift illustrates how consumer safety awareness, bolstered by scientific research, propelled safer household product development. Number 7. Coal tar shampoo and soap. Coal tar, a byproduct of coal processing, was once hailed for its antibacterial properties, leading to its inclusion in dandruff shampoos, soaps, and skin treatments in the mid-20th century. Popular among many Gen X parents in the 1970s, these products often featured in pharmacy aisles, promising relief from itchy scalps or skin irritations. However, scientists discovered that certain compounds within coal tar could be carcinogenic. The distinctive scent hinted at its chemical potency, but the widespread marketing overshadowed potential risks. Regulatory agencies gradually imposed concentration limits, especially when studies suggested links to skin issues and increased cancer risk in lab tests. By the 1980s, many brands reformulated or pulled coal tar-based items from shelves, turning to safer antifungal or medicinal alternatives. Nowadays, only prescription-strength coal tar products remain, closely monitored for their usage and concentration. They're a relic from a time when convenience and speed overshadowed thorough safety scrutiny. Number 8. Formaldehyde in home textiles. Prior to the 1980s, manufacturers commonly treated curtains, furniture, upholstery, and even children's bedding with formaldehyde-based resins to reduce wrinkles and mildew. The chemical gave fabrics that crisp, fresh from the factory feel. People living in post-war suburban homes, shown in vintage photo albums and nostalgic American advertisements, prized permanent press materials for their convenience. Yet formaldehyde off-gassing could cause headaches, respiratory irritation, and allergic reactions, especially in small children or sensitive adults. Prolonged exposure raised fears of more severe health effects, like certain cancers. By the 1990s, consumer advocates pushed for stricter testing, and numerous brands started minimizing or eliminating formaldehyde in textile processing. That shift aligned with a broader movement toward improving indoor air quality. Formaldehyde-laden textiles are now largely a memory, though older linens hidden away in attics or retro collectible shops can occasionally still harbor these residues. Number 9. Radium-infused clock dials. Throughout the mid-20th century, glowing clock faces and watch dials were achieved by painting numbers with radium-based paint. In a dimly lit 1950s living room, a softly glowing alarm clock on the nightstand seemed cutting edge. Skilled workers, often dubbed radium girls, painstakingly hand-painted these dials in factories, sadly unaware of the radioactive hazards. As time passed, scientists recognized the grave health consequences from the radioactive emissions, including bone cancer and radiation sickness. By the 1970s, radium was phased out in favor of safer luminescent compounds. Modern collectors of vintage clocks occasionally stumble upon these relics, prompting caution about radioactivity. Although the glow-in-the-dark novelty captured the era's fascination, it taught a sobering lesson about how easily excitement over novelty can overshadow long-term safety. Number 10. Carbon tetrachloride fire extinguishers. In the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, handheld fire extinguishers filled with carbon tetrachloride were promoted as essential household safety devices. The chemical effectively smothered flames by inhibiting combustion. However, when heated, carbon tetrachloride released toxic fumes, including phosgene, a notorious war gas. Anyone using it in an enclosed space risked severe respiratory harm or even fatal exposure. Despite these hazards, they were considered efficient for grease fires in vintage kitchens or small car engine blazes. Once scientific research clarified the serious toxicity, especially if inhaled in enclosed areas, governments imposed bans in the 1960s. Safer extinguishing agents such as dry chemical powders or carbon dioxide replaced the carbon tetrachloride models. Sometimes found in retro vehicle trunks or antique stores, these extinguishers are no longer recommended for use. It's a prime example of how a quick fix in product design can come at a high hidden cost. Number 11. Benzene in spot removers. In the early to mid-20th century, benzene was a go-to solvent in various stain removers and degreasers. Ads from the golden age of radio boasted about benzene-based formulas that could lift tough stains from clothes, carpets, and furniture. Housewives of the 1950s found these quick solutions appealing as they juggled household chores. Yet, benzene is now recognized as a potent carcinogen that can affect bone marrow and blood cell production. Workers in factories manufacturing these products reported dizziness and respiratory issues after prolonged contact. By the 1970s, many nations either banned or heavily restricted benzene in consumer goods, citing evidence linking long-term exposure to leukemia. Modern spot cleaners typically rely on gentler solvents, reflecting heightened awareness of both user and environmental safety. Number 12. Cadmium-coated metal toys. Child-focused advertising in the 1960s and 1970s often showcased bright metal cars, trains, and action figures, some coated with cadmium-based pigments for eye-catching colors. Unfortunately, cadmium can accumulate in the body over time and damage the kidneys, bones, and respiratory system. Curious kids might have even chewed on a toy's edges, exposing themselves to invisible toxins. Parents simply didn't suspect that the captivating colors concealed harmful metals. By the late 1980s, awareness grew about cadmium's hazardous effects, prompting a wave of regulations limiting heavy metals in children's products. Manufacturers shifted to safer paints and coatings, ensuring that modern toys meet stricter guidelines. Vintage toy collectors, however, are advised to keep these older items out of reach, especially if they show wear or flaking paint. Number 13. Chloral hydrate sedatives in medicine cabinets. Through much of the 20th century, chloral hydrate was an over-the-counter sedative used to combat insomnia or calm nerves. Television commercials of the 1950s sometimes promoted gentle sleep aids, with bottles occasionally stored in family bathrooms alongside other everyday remedies. Unfortunately, chloral hydrate can be highly addictive, and overdoses pose severe threats to the central nervous system. It was also occasionally misused, leading to dangerous sedation. By the 1970s, tighter pharmaceutical regulations and new, safer medications curtailed its availability. Doctors began prescribing alternatives less prone to abuse or overdose. The near disappearance of chloral hydrate from drugstore shelves underscores the evolution of medical standards, shaped by a deeper understanding of side effects and long-term risks. Number 14. Benzidine inhalers. Popular during the 1930s to 1950s, these small tubes contained amphetamine-based compounds intended to relieve nasal congestion. Also featured in certain old Hollywood films, they were sometimes used recreationally by night owls seeking an energy boost. However, repeated use proved to be habit-forming, and side effects ranged from dizziness and elevated heart rate to severe dependency. Baby boomers may recall older relatives who casually kept one of these inhalers in their purses or pockets, unaware of the addiction hazard. Eventually, medical professionals recognized the risk of stimulant abuse, leading to tighter control of amphetamine-based treatments in the 1960s. Modern decongestants rely on much milder active ingredients, demonstrating how changing perspectives on drug safety drastically altered product availability. Number 15. Polychlorinated biphenyl, PCB electrical components. PCBs gained popularity from the 1920s through the 1970s for use in transformers, capacitors, and household appliances because they were stable and resistant to heat. Televisions, radios, and even some kitchen gadgets of the baby boomer era relied on PCB-laden components to function reliably. Yet, the same chemical stability made them persist in the environment, where they could accumulate in animal tissue and move up the food chain. Health researchers discovered that PCBs disrupt endocrine function, damage the immune system, and potentially cause cancer. The 1970s saw an outcry from environmentalists, culminating in bans and strict regulations in the US and elsewhere. Over time, appliances have transitioned to safer, non-PCB parts. This shift reveals how scientific insights into toxic bioaccumulation reshaped entire manufacturing processes, ensuring that families no longer keep such silent hazards in their living rooms. Number 16. Arsenic-based rat poison. Common in mid-century homes, boxes of powdered arsenic formulations were placed under sinks or in basements to tackle rodent problems. Sometimes, black and white TV commercials or local radio ads describe them as the surefire solution for pests. However, arsenic is acutely toxic to humans, and accidents were not uncommon if children or pets accidentally ingested the poison. Chronic exposure, even at low levels, could lead to organ damage, neurological issues, and higher cancer risk. By the 1970s, alternative rodenticides with reduced toxicity gained favor, and stronger child safety packaging was introduced. regulatory agencies began restricting open sale of arsenic-based products, leading to safer approaches for controlling infestations at home. Number 17. Xray shoe-fitting fluoroscopes. In the 1940s and 1950s, many American shoe stores featured a curious device that let customers see the bones of their feet inside the shoes to ensure a perfect fit. This novelty, appealing to families with kids, used low-level X-rays. Yet repeated exposure could exceed safe radiation doses, especially for workers operating the machines daily. By the 1960s, health authorities realized that inadequate shielding and unregulated usage put employees and frequent customers at risk of thyroid damage, leukemia, and other radiation-induced conditions. Swiftly, states began outlawing or strictly regulating the devices. They disappeared from mainstream shoe stores, replaced by simple measuring devices and well-trained sales staff. Today, only a few examples survive in museums, signifying how enthrallment with novelty technology can mask underappreciated dangers. Number 18. Mercury-containing pesticides. While DDT dominated headlines in the 1960s, mercury-based fungicides and pesticides were also routinely used on seeds, lawns, and garden plants. The 20th century push for pristine, pest-free suburban lawns led many households to apply these chemicals without protective gear. Runoff contaminated local water sources and, in turn, accumulated in fish and wildlife, echoing patterns seen with other heavy metals. Mercury's neurotoxic effects can damage developing brains, making children particularly vulnerable. Revelations in the 1970s regarding widespread mercury poisoning in certain communities led authorities to ban or heavily restrict such compounds. Modern landscaping usually favors safer or more targeted products, reflecting a broader environmental awareness that blossomed in the post-baby boomer era. Number 19. Ammonia-based hair bleaching kits. Do-it-yourself hair lightening soared in popularity during the 1960s and 1970s, inspired by rock and roll icons and old Hollywood starlets. Many home bleaching kits contained high concentrations of ammonia alongside hydrogen peroxide, resulting in harsh fumes that irritated eyes, nose, and throat. Though baby boomers recall these kits as a cheap alternative to salon visits, frequent usage could damage the scalp and weaken hair shafts. In poorly ventilated bathrooms, vapor inhalation posed respiratory risks. By the 1980s, manufacturers refined formulas to reduce ammonia concentrations and introduced better safety instructions on packaging. The rise of professional salons and improved product formulations rendered those old, pungent bleaching kits largely obsolete. Still, they remain a memory of an era when novelty hair trends often overshadowed health considerations. Number 20. White lead cosmetics. For centuries, fair skin was seen as a beauty standard, with many consumers from the 1930s nostalgia era to earlier periods using face powders or creams containing white lead. In old black and white films, the ghostly pallor of certain actresses was partially achieved through these toxic concoctions. Gradual absorption of lead through the skin could result in anemia, muscle weakness, and neurological damage. Some reported chronic migraines and skin lesions. Although the link between lead and ill health had been recognized earlier, a lack of oversight kept these products on the market. By the mid-20th century, stricter regulations demanded the removal of lead from cosmetic formulas. This paved the way for safer alternatives that adhered to new public health guidelines. Nevertheless, the historical usage highlights how deeply entrenched toxic substances were in everyday grooming, all for the sake of style.